For that reason, we actually say that it's important that you as a supervisor should have superior knowledge, but not a superior relationship. The power play should not be there. But we also acknowledge that conflict happens, right? But that conflict also depends on the kind of supervision model that you use. Remember, we had 5 different supervision models. And we say that if you are going to use a relationship model to do your supervision, you need to have very good conflict management skills. You might recall Prof had an incident where he invited students to a braai at his house. And then that sort of turned out to be negative because dynamics are there. But we know that that situation was managed. So the point I'm trying to emphasize is you should be able to manage those conflicts. We also mentioned that in addition to the 5 different models of supervision, you can actually have hybrid approaches, right? And those hybrid approaches are important because, as someone said this morning, not all your students are elephants, and not all your students are birds, not all your students are fish. So students are different. You have a style that you have as a supervisor, but your students also have styles, right? I really have a passion for teaching, and one of the things that I try to do when I'm teaching in my classes is try and understand how my students learn, right? And having moved institutions, I've sort of stubbed my toe several times where I've gone into a class and I assume that this institution, these students sitting before me are very similar to the students I had where I came from. And then I look at my pass rate and you find 50% of my students have failed. And you know, you've got to remember, when your students fail, it's not always the students. Part of that failure is you, right? So you need to look back, step back and think, what is it that I didn't do right? You know, so that's really important, that reflection. And it's important when you're supervising because you've got to remember when your student submits that piece of work, it's got your name for life. And sometimes students hate me for that because I will not allow you to submit if I think your work is not ready, because my name is forever married to yours for the rest of my life. So it's very important that we adjust, you know, our attitude, we adjust our style depending on the student. So that's where we stopped yesterday. And we were just getting into the details of the different approaches. I did give a summary, so I'm going to go through this quite quickly. If you are going to use the functional approach, you may recall that we said the functional approach is the kind of approach where the supervisor is a very logical person, likes organization, likes, you know, diaries and everything must be, you know, in order, all your ducks in a row, and it's going to, but what you need then is to be able to monitor the student. You as a supervisor must be the kind of person who's a stickler for time, you know, because if you're going to use the functional approach, you need to be able to monitor the student and make sure the student is meeting those milestones that have been stipulated in their study plan, okay? And you need to focus on application of what has been learned, step-by-step application, and you need to emphasize on the acquisition of skills. We talked about that yesterday. Okay. The next approach that we talked about was enculturalization. You remember I said in this particular approach is where you see your discipline as a sort of a club, if you like, right? And a PhD is therefore bringing you into that club, making you one of us, right? Now, if you take that approach, which I must say is a fairly obsolete one these days, remember what I said, in those days, we used to say if I have a PhD, I'm one of a few, right? So it was a very special club, right? And worse if you belong to certain disciplines. I remember when I was doing my undergrad, come on, we're all in the same school, you and I. Do you remember when you were in the social sciences and the people from natural sciences thought you were doing something that didn't make sense? Understand what I'm talking about? Okay, and so there are these clubs. So if you are going to be an engineer, you must have certain minimums for us to accept you into that school. If you're going to be an economist, you must think in a particular way. We want you to think in a particular way. But again, as I mentioned yesterday, PhD doctoral study has changed over time, right? It's something that's open to more people. So as much as we're acknowledging this type of supervision, I wouldn't advise it because it's an obsolete way of looking at doctoral study. And in those days, 99% of the people who got their PhDs went on to be academics. These days, people get PhDs just to increase their paycheck, right? And we have also changed. We also have PhDs that are related to practice. We call them professional PhDs, right? You have professional PhDs. So things have changed. So when you talk about enculturalization, there are positive things you can pick from this approach, but do remember, it's a fairly obsolete way of thinking about postgraduate study. Okay, the next one is critical thinking, and I did indicate yesterday that this is more of the approach where I find myself. I use hybrid approaches, but this is more of where I find myself because critical thinking really is the traditional heart of the PhD program. Why is that? Because the PhD program requires the creation of knowledge. That is really important because when a student comes to you with a research question, you must ask them, at the end of the day, what are you going to produce? One of the challenges that we have, and those of you that have supervised PhD students may have experienced this, but one of the problems that we have had is where students write. Students think a PhD is writing. So you get this chapter with this many pages, and actually nothing has been said on all those pages, right? So it's very important that there is a creation of knowledge, and that creation of knowledge requires critical thinking. Bear in mind, we said, as somebody said, student-centered learning, right? So the student is the one creating the knowledge. You are providing the guidance, not the instruction. In fact, some universities now call supervisors, they call them promoters. You're the promoter, you're the advisor. Just to bear in mind what your role is. So critical thinking is very important. So those who supervise using this approach see research as a process of discovering things, uncovering, unearthing meanings. And I did share with you yesterday that my current research focus is on financial inclusion and informality. My interest started when I was working on a project on informality, a very small project. Actually, Prof, it was our RNA project that I started. And I was sharing with a friend that I was going to the market and I was going to talk to the traders. And I explained to him what I was doing. And then he said to me, but why do you call it informal? And I thought, oh, that's the phrase. We call it informality. Why are you asking me why we call it informality? After he left, I really reflected because he said to me, I don't know why you call it that because our ancestors have always done business in that way. I wonder how many of us have really thought about it. We passed the person selling the tomatoes by the street and we're on our way to ShopRite because in our minds, we only buy the tomatoes if they're cheaper, right? It's not really where we want to be seen doing our shopping. We want to be seen doing our shopping in Pick and Pay, in ShopRite, but really, these small and micro businesses drive African economy. And it started me on a path where I have now sat to try and reflect, what does it really mean to be an informal business? And I strive not to call them informal, I call them family or subsistence businesses, right? So when you're doing your PhD, it's critical thinking. You need to ask questions, you need to unearth. Go to the people who are selling these things on the street. Do you know we make a lot of assumptions about people? Like if you look at the literature on informality, we say informality is for people who don't have education, who don't have an option. When we have been collecting our data, we found people who have master's degrees, and they are making a lot of money. We found one guy in Joburg who makes about 9,000 rand a day. I'm sure you'd give up your job, right? To go and sell things on the street if you're going to make that kind of money. So I think we need to unearth meanings as a PhD. So this approach encourages students to think, to critically think about the things that they observe. Okay? So the objective when you're using this approach is the application of experience, the development of sound critical thinking, and it's really central in my view to designing new solutions to African problems. So I would encourage at least making it part of your hybrid process. And then we've got mentoring. Mentoring, basically you let the person get on with it, right? So this is where you see some universities, like I say, they say a promoter or an advisor or something like that, because they have taken this mentoring attitude. The student knows what they want to do. Your role is to push them along. Yesterday, I used the word nudge, right? To say like, you know, are you working? Are you working? Are you going in the right direction? Consider looking at this, and so on and so forth. So the supervision is a facilitative process which requires support and challenge. That is mentoring. You're supposed to support students in constructing knowledge. Knowledge is constructed based on your experiences of, your past, current experiences and expectations of the future, right? So you don't construct knowledge by rote memorization, which is why if you rote memorize something, after a while it disappears from your head because you haven't constructed any knowledge. So it's very important to inquire and to construct knowledge from experience, from observation. And it's very enabling and very empowering. Think of your student. If the student goes and researches, let's say we're talking about experiences in poverty. I don't know what the small townships in Kabwe are. So let me just mention the ones I know in Osaka. So if we say that we're looking at poverty in Kanyama, right? And someone's going in there to see what are the drivers, what keeps people trapped in poverty. Why? People in Kanyama go to school, right? You all know, people in townships go to school, but the majority of them never leave those places, right? So we send a PhD student there to go and talk to the people, spend time with them, inquire, and then they come out and they're able to explain because they were reflecting, because they were constructing that knowledge as they spoke to the people. Do you think that person will cower when you ask them to stand in front and present the work? They are going to be confident, isn't it? Because they have learned something that means something, rather than somebody who just sits there, memorizes the theories. When they stand here, they're not even sure if they have memorized everything correctly. So inquiry-based learning is very important for supervision. So that is the mentorship approach. Lastly, we have relationship development, which I think we spoke about quite a lot yesterday, so I'm not going to spend much time on this. But in this case, we know that research is about creating something new that has personal value. So as a supervisor, then you involve the career guidance of the student, you're creating knowledge. And one of the things that I found in a number of students that I supervise, in South Africa, particularly because of apartheid, a lot of students say, no, because in those days, we didn't have access to school. And they speak very passionately about how they were disadvantaged, but then they fail to move from that point to the construction of knowledge, right? So when you're supervising using a relationship model, yours is to take the student from that point where the problem means something to them, to the creation of knowledge that would provide solutions to that area that they're passionate about, okay? Because learning is a shared development. And of course, in this particular model, power relationships are very important. That this is where we talked about conflict management, right? Really important that when you are using this approach, you're able to manage conflict. You and your student, the student must understand that you're operating at the same level, though you have superior knowledge, you are not superior to them, so that they have, the problem with power play in supervision is that your student doesn't create knowledge. They're waiting for you to tell them what to do. So it's really important that they know that if they make a contribution, they say something to you, that you are not just sitting there waiting to say something back to them, that what they say to you actually matters. And when your student knows that what they say matters, they will go out and try to learn more. You can just nudge them in the different directions that they need to go. Right, so the next two slides I won't really spend much time on because we have a very short session. It's just outlining the advantages and disadvantages of each approach. I've tried to mention them as I went along, but you will get these slides, as I said, so you can look at the advantages and disadvantages of each approach. And during the reception, during the, let's waiting for him to mute. people. It would be nice for you to reflect. So we're going to have a short period where you just reflect, what kind of supervisor am I? Or what kind of supervisor would I like to be? I think that's important. So the next, and then this one is on the dependence and independence of the same approaches. Again, I've covered some of that already. In fact, all of it, as I discussed. Okay, so I found this really fascinating quotation from Dr. Araya, who is an ideal supervisor. And I'm just going to read through this. And when I finish, I want those who think they meet these qualifications to just raise their hand, right? Including the people online. Please find the raise your hand facility. Okay, the dream supervisor has the following attributes: the wisdom of Solomon, a positively Delphic prescience in their pronouncements of what will matter, the communicative skills of Martin Luther King, the analytical clarity of Ada Lovelace, the patience of a saint, a pastoral touch that would make Florence Nightingale weep with envy, a breadth and depth of knowledge that could only come from omniscience, creative gifts that combine the brilliance of Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Michelangelo, and Mozart with the inspiring iconoclasm of Pablo Picasso, Einstein, and the Beatles, and to cap it all, an emphatic sense that must have been stolen from Mahatma Gandhi. Hands up. That person doesn't exist, right? But that's the ideal supervisor. That is true. That's like the perfect supervisor, right? If you had all those qualities, you would be able to supervise using any of the 5 that we have used. And I have written there that the moral of the story, you will find it in slide 13. Slide 13 is where we have the different animals, right? Essentially, that supervisor does not exist, right? Which means don't be hard on yourself, right? You cannot, I mean, somebody yesterday, I don't know, I think it was you yesterday, you said, sometimes you just, the student is sitting before you, you just have to do what you gotta do. My daughter likes to say, it is what it is. It is what it is, you know? So you've got to make it work. But there are times when you can't. And that's really important. You know, most of us don't want to get there. I have had cases where I have surrendered the student. I have called the postgraduate coordinator and the head of department, and I've said, listen, this relationship is not working. Would you get this student another supervisor? Before I do that, I sit with the student and I say, listen, it's not going to work. I've tried, you've tried, because you've got to remember that the relationship is two-way, right? So again, I emphasize, if the student fails, it's not entirely up to the student. Sometimes the fault is almost entirely the student. Sometimes the fault is almost yours, entirely yours, but there is a portion that belongs to everyone. So you sit, you talk, and with the particular student that I'm talking about, firstly, the topic. I tried to advise against that topic, and the student just kept on going, kept on going. Eventually, I said, okay, fine. You know, it was a master's student. We started working, and we tried, and we tried. First year, couldn't submit a proposal. Second year, couldn't submit a proposal. Remember I said with our master's students, they have to pass their proposal within 4 months. Now we are in the second year, and this person is due to be excluded, and I've done everything that I can. And I just said to her, I said, Jackie, I think you and I, it's not going to work. For your sake, I think let's get somebody else. No, Prof, I said, no, I think for your sake, let's get somebody else. Anyway, I think you're right. You know, I don't think you listened to me. I said, okay, no, it's fine. You know, and I acknowledge there are times, you know, especially in those days, not very good at listening, you know. So I said, no, that's true, actually. Maybe I don't listen because I don't understand what you're doing. So let's just get somebody else. That was 2017. She's still doing her master's now. I gave her to somebody else. That person is struggling with her, but is not willing to give up. From 2017, we're now in 2021. The student, 5 years later, is still doing her master's. She only applied for ethics clearance this year. So I'm saying sometimes it can't. Ne? Sometimes it's 1 - 5. It can't, and you must approach that carefully with the student, discuss and say, look, this is your career, this is my career, right? For us, if students are not progressing, it's a big deal. I'm sure you also have something in place, Dr. Director, where you can't keep a student forever in the stream because we actually lose subsidy after a while, right? So the government stops subsidizing students that stay long in the system. So you need to get out of the system. There is at a point where you must acknowledge I have failed. As academics, we're a little bit high hosts in our nature and we don't like failure. So sending away a student is like a sign of failure. So we don't want to do it. But it's really important to remember that just because the student has not succeeded doesn't mean you are a failure. Look at the student. Your interest must always be in the student's best interest. And if it's not in the student's best interest to continue that relationship, you must end that relationship and push the student on. Right, so the next few slides, we'll be looking at student expectation. I won't be long with that. Somebody asked a question and I'm just wondering whether I can make this bigger, but I think you should be able to see, right? Now, remember yesterday we said that doctoral training has changed. And one of the biggest changes that we're experiencing is part-time PhDs. Most of them who already have families. We talked about influences on supervision. Your student, if they are married, has kids, worse if they are female. When they get home, there must be a wife, there must be a mother, right? And you want your proposal tomorrow. Somewhere in between, they must cook, they must clean the house, they must go to work. Remember, they're part-time, right? They must go to work. So think about it. You have 24 hours in a day. Part of that day, you must sleep, right? So when you are looking at your students, remember that there are influences in their lives. Sometimes people are not able to deliver, not because they don't want to work, but because of the situation they find themselves. What I do with my part-time students is we sit and we say, what do you think can work for you? Sometimes I have taken my full-time students and asked them to go part-time because I can just see it's not working. They're not getting there. Sometimes you get really good part-time students. I was just sharing with Prof. One of the students that I took in 2018, she was working full-time as a director in one of the government departments. She finished her PhD and graduated in December, was it December last year? She said, Prof, I've decided that every day I'm going to go to bed at 8 o'clock and I will wake up at 3 o'clock. I will do my PhD before I prepare to go to work. And so for the whole period that she was doing her PhD, she went to bed at 8 o'clock. She woke up at 3. From 3 to 7, she did her PhD. And then she went to work time every day. And she finished her PhD in 3 years. You need to sit with your students and say, what are the hurdles that you see in your life? You have a family, how young are your children? You have a husband, has your husband bought into this? You have a wife, has your wife bought into? If your spouse doesn't buy into the PhD, those of you that are planning to do your PhD, your spouse must buy into that PhD because PhD becomes your life. So as a supervisor, you need to be conscious of the fact that students have various influences. And then of course, there's the question of when are you going to finish, right? So they have, you've been doing this thing. When are you going to finish it? You know, they want to know, right? They want to know. You're lucky if your kids are small, it's just your spouse that bugging. Your boss, we've been paying. When are you going to finish? So you need to really have compassion. So I'm speaking both to those of you that are students or are going to be students shortly, and to those of you that are supervisors, that you need to understand that these are student expectations and influences. Sleep deprivation can actually be a problem. I've just given you Vuyo's experience where a student needs to really think, what can I do? What changes can I make? And I always say to students, you know what you should put on hold? Your social life. Don't put your family on hold. Whatever you do, don't put your family on hold. You can put your social life on hold for 3 years, for 4 years. And then social life is always there afterwards. But you must sleep, you must eat, and you must mind your family. Those are very important to discuss with your students. Because I have had experiences where a student starts off really well, first year passes their proposal in record time. I mean, I have a student, we're just talking about this, she's a colleague of ours. She went record time, proposal, everything, collected data. I expected her to graduate in 2018. She's still doing her PhD. She's had 2 babies along the way. She's had 2 babies along the way. What are your priorities? Really, you know, okay, sometimes you're old, if you wait having babies, it might not work, right? So you gotta have the babies. But sometimes the students are young enough to say, listen, discuss with your spouse, do you really want to have babies now? This particular, seriously, these are things you need to talk about. And I know some of these are taboo in our culture, right? But we've accepted the PhD as part of our culture. So we need to address these things. Because otherwise a 4-year program becomes a 12-year program. And think about it, you as the supervisor, I mean, I'm sure you have the same issue here at Mulungushi. As a supervisor, you can only have so many students, isn't it? So if you have a student that's on your table for 10 years, it means you can't take on any more students. They're stalling your progress as a supervisor. So you've got to think about that. So it's really important. And students ask a lot of questions. The questions you should never allude to. Can you tell me what to do? You never tell a PhD student what to do. But the other questions, you must listen. And I'm telling you as someone who has experience of not listening. You know, I was the kind of person that someone is talking, I'm waiting for them to stop so I can talk. I don't know if any of you are like that, but I was there. Experience has taught me that when someone is talking, you really must listen. Because sometimes someone will be saying something and what they are saying is in between the words. It's not really what they're saying, but you know what I mean? We need to read in between the lines. We need to read in between the lines. But if you're not listening to your student, you won't be able to know. They're probably trying to tell you, listen, I'm struggling at home. But because you're not listening, you're just focused on that chapter that they're supposed to submit. You're not listening. Students have expectations and influences. You can read the rest. I think I've made my point, right? Okay. Student expectations of your time, very important, availability. I learned something when I was working at Hertfordshire. We had what were called thesis logs or dissertation logs. You were expected to meet your master's student at least 8 times a year. So we were given a sheet, and every time you meet, you both sign. This is what we discussed. We sign on this, that you both sign, and you keep a log. Now, I've continued that habit because it saved me. Yesterday, somebody talked about a student not graduating and blaming the supervisor. I had that experience, I think I mentioned yesterday. But then I had that log where I was constantly emailing the student and telling the student to submit. When the appeals board was called, I prepared this file and I gave it to my line manager. She looked at that folder and she said, there's no need for this meeting. So that log is very important. It will protect you, it will protect the student. So think about, even if it's not a requirement in your institution, think about doing that for yourself. It's very important because students have a crazy demand on your time. They will not pitch when you ask them to pitch, and they will pitch when you don't want them to pitch. Okay? They'll call you at night. They'll call you on Sunday. They'll call you on Saturday. When you're supposed to be with your family, going to church, having a good time, students are on your case. I have a student who emails me and texts me at least once every day, literally. Now, if you have 10 of them, imagine what happens to you. And the thing is that when your students are constantly on your case, it's not even the actual time. It's the stress it puts on your mind. So you need to manage your time. Students expect you to be available. Yeah. Yes. Yes. You do get students like that. I sent you a document. Have you read it? When did you send it? At 8 this morning. Boy, looks like it's 9 o'clock now. You know, so you get that. You need to really set those expectations. And for me, what I found with that log is that if you have a student who listens, so this one I'm telling you about really doesn't care what I've said or put it, she just calls me. What it does is that it tells students when you're available for them. My life has been taken away a little bit the last 2 years because of the administration I've been doing. But one of the things I used to do when I wasn't in this admin space is that right at the beginning of the year, I tell my students, Mondays and Thursdays are consultation days. If you come on any other day, I will open the door and say, come back on Thursday, and close the door. I know it sounds rude, but think about your time. We're here talking about research. You have to publish, you have to teach, you have to do community engagement, you have to have family. If you don't manage your time, students will take up all your time. So availability is important, but plan your regular supervisions. Let students know when you're available and when you're not. And because 90% of the time they will violate that, the only way you can control it is by saying no when they come at the wrong time. Tell them wrong class, come on Thursday, right? So really important. And of course you must be open and supportive. It's very important. I have really benefited from that. My students, most of them call me mom. It's a bit weird, but yeah, it works, right? They say my mother. Some of them are older than me. That's all right. I'm a mother to so many people. It's a privilege to be a mom. But I've developed an open and supportive relationship with them, which is why I'm able to say to them, you know what, this friendship is very good, but the academic side is not working. So, but if you're constantly fighting with a student, when you want to let them go, what do you think they'll say? It's because he or she doesn't like me, isn't it? So you need to be supportive, you need to be friendly, okay? You need to give constructive criticism. It's really important. So we talked about students yesterday, I think it was you, Dr. Marongwa, who said you keep giving feedback and the student keeps bringing back the same thing. Sometimes we need to just sit as students and just say, no, if you send this back, I will not read it. We need to be able to put boundaries, but also the way we give feedback is very important. It needs to be constructive. So before I did my degree, my degree in teaching, I used to give feedback by saying all the things that were wrong with what I'm reading. And when I went into a classroom, those of you that are in education already know what I'm about to say. I learned that you start by saying something positive about what you're assessing. And sometimes it's really hard to find something positive about what you're reading. But you've got to find it. Somebody has written something, there must be something good you can say. Even if you say, it's good you've submitted on time, but, you know? So when you start that way, then the person who's reading that feedback is more likely to read the rest of your feedback and really think and engage with the feedback that you've given them. So constructive criticism is really important. And for me, I've written that down because that's the way I deal with things. You might have a different way of dealing with things. I find that asking questions really helps me because then I'm not telling the student, I'm asking them and they're able to see, yeah, I see what you're talking about. Because I've allowed them to really think about what they've written and whether it makes sense. I just took on a master's student not long ago. And I was looking at the theories that she was putting in her proposal. Those of you that are economists, she put, what was the policy? I think she put a growth theory. I can't remember what growth theory she put. She put some Keynesian theories. And then the work that she was doing was on dualism in the financial sector. So I said to her, do you know what this theory says? let's take, for example, the theory, the life cycle theory. Do you know what the theory says? She says, she explains it to me. And then I say, so what part of that theory talks about informal and formal finance, or finance at all? Nothing. So you see, I could have simply said, these theories you put here are not relevant. They go and find other theories. But I asked her, and before we finished that session, she was able to say, I can see what you're talking about. This is not relevant. So I use that approach. I'm not saying it's the approach, but I'm saying that it is a very useful approach. And you could have your own other approach, which you use in order to give constructive criticism. The last thing I'm going to talk about is conflict, because we've spoken a lot about it. One of the major causes of conflict is lack of communication. That's why it's so important that you're able to have that friendly and supportive approach to your students, because then it helps you. So in overcoming strategies, you discuss expectations right at the beginning. I mean, I've already gone through many of these, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Give sufficient notice, draw up an agenda for meetings, record the outcomes of your meetings, alert supervisors to problems that may arise if you have co-supervisors. So like I said, you remember that log that I talked about? What I do with that log is every time I have a meeting with my student, I let the student go back and write down, these are the agreements that we made during our meeting, whether it was an electronic meeting or a face-to-face meeting. They write a summary and they send it back to me. And I look and I check whether they've misrepresented something or missed something. If everything is okay, I sign the log. If it's not okay, I send it back to them with my comments until we get that log right. And then we put expectations for the next meeting. What are the outcomes that you will deal with between now and the next time that we meet? So when we meet, there's a portion on that log as well, which says progress and addressing of outcomes. So they will write down, ahead of that meeting, they'll write down how they have addressed the commitments that we made at the previous meeting. And then when we sit, that document becomes our operational document. Obviously, I've changed it over time, so I didn't have that part in the original when I first started using it, when it was introduced to me. But over time, I have found that that has really helped me, and it really helps with managing conflict. Mismatched expectations, again, keep expectations realistic. Remember all those influences that we talked about. If you say to someone, just at a meeting, I want a revised version next week, you know this person is working, you know this person has a family. Do you really expect them to give you the revised version next week? I think it's unrealistic, right? So have realistic expectations, be organized, be professional, open and flexible, okay? And then personality clashes. Sometimes it can't. I'm going to keep saying that. Sometimes your personality and the other person's personality just don't work. It's not because they're bad or you're bad, it's just the two of you just don't work, right? You're a negative and a negative, and that doesn't work. Sometimes you just have to acknowledge that. And then my advice is, go to the postgraduate coordinator, go to the director and say, look, I think this relationship is not working. This student has a good research proposal, has a good research idea, but I think it needs to be guided by somebody else. Okay. And then you've got competing pressures, which again, I've already talked about. Be honest, compromise, but don't over-compromise. That's really important. Give sufficient notices for requests, and do remember you're both human, really. And I think sometimes maybe we think the students are more human than we are, in the sense that we can't make mistakes, but we can. We make mistakes, right? So as supervisors, we need to be conscious of that. I think those are issues that I'll just leave there for you to consider. Student numbers, maybe let me highlight a few things. Somebody raised the supervisor, co-supervisor conflict yesterday, right? And then we also had it as a question down there. And when students need to change supervisors, I've addressed that one. Timeliness and university regulations, I think we also talked about that yesterday. It's your role to oversee and ensure that you have an eye on the bigger picture, that the student is complying with university regulations. The best way is to give them the booklet right at the start. Let them read, understand what is expected of them, and then publishing with your students. There was also a question on that. So I'm just going to go quickly. And Prof, if you can help me to address some of these, that would be very helpful. Okay. When you have student numbers, large student numbers, what I do is I use a group supervision approach. So like I said, now if your research question is not in my area, I try to avoid you, right? So I bring my students together right at the beginning. I let them share ideas. So that's really important for me, that they can understand that they are doing related things, different things. It also helps them to see the holistic picture. Right? But even if your students are not doing the same thing, group supervision is very useful. So at the beginning, I get them together to really just go through the regulatory issues. These are the different stages you're going to go through. In terms of your question, this is how you phrase your question. So I use a lot of group supervision. And once they've passed their proposals, I also use what I call post-panel presentations. I bring my students at least once a year together. They make presentations of their work. I ask colleagues. Prof. Willie has been a victim many times. I ask my colleagues to come and assess my students, and they get feedback from a different person, because when you keep talking to the same person about the same thing, sometimes they close their ears, right? Stop listening to you. So my colleagues come, they assess my students, they listen to them, and they give a different perspective. That group supervision helps me. I don't know, Prof, if you have something to add on student numbers, Dr. Marongo, how to handle large numbers of students? Mm. Two PhDs. Oh. Yeah, it's really important, because sometimes you don't have a choice. I remember once I had, how many, 15 PhDs, but that's because students sometimes don't want to work with a particular person, and you're the only deflection they can come to. Sometimes colleagues leave the institution, and then you have to take over students. But it's really important. Like now, I am not taking more than 5 students at any one time, because what that means is that you're spending time reading other people's work and not really developing yourself. So the numbers are very important. Dr. Marongo, did you want to add something?
Especially for honors students, there are so many. Then you can look for a master student or an honor student who is very good to be in charge of that. Because sometimes students, they listen more when it's coming from one of their peers. They have a tendency of opening up. And when you give them that space to work on their own, then you find that result.
Thank you. Does anybody wants to share something in the audience? Have you had large student numbers in the supervision space? No? Okay. Supervisor, co-supervisor conflict. I think Prof alluded to the agreement that we now use in our institution, which is basically when you start the supervision process, when you have a co-supervisor, there's a space at the bottom, at least the one we use for economics. There's a space at the bottom which names who the main supervisor is, what percentage or proportion of the supervision load is going to belong to the main supervisor and which will belong to the rest of the supervisors on the team. And who, because you are the main supervisor, at the end of the day, you take the major decisions. So that is very important. Another thing that I have done in my personal practice is that when I'm co-supervising, when we start, I say, okay, I am going to be responsible for the literature review and the theoretical framework. You will be responsible for the methodology. You will be responsible for the analysis, which means if there's a conflict in the area that I'm responsible for, I have the last say. Right? So that's very important. Others contribute to that section, but they can't force me. Now, obviously, the problem is if the person who is wrong is the person who's responsible for that space. That can happen. And when a thing like that happens, I think the best thing is please don't argue in front of the students. Don't. Prof talked about that fight with the mother and father and the children and so on. That is so important. You know, we've seen this happen and then it just discourages the student. In fact, we've seen cases where as a result of that, students have left the department and gone to another department. They just can't take that kind of bickering between the supervisors. If you have an issue, even if it's a huge issue, please take it outside. Take it to where there's just the two of you. And if the conflict is not resolved, involve the director or the postgraduate coordinator to resolve that conflict, but never in front of the student. Another thing that really helps me is that we coordinate our feedback when we're co-supervisors. I read the student's work and I send it to my colleague. I say, these are the comments I've made before we send it to the student. So that if there's something that we don't agree on, we resolve it, the two of us, before it goes to the student. That's very, very important. Especially if the person you're working with is not somebody that you're close to. Mostly the people that I work with are people that I write with, I do other things with. So we have a very collegial relationship. But even in those cases, it's very important to share the feedback before it goes to the student so that you're minimizing the potential for conflict. What if, okay, that should read what if. What if the student wants to change supervisors? My answer is let them. I really, honestly, I would say 100% of the time, if the student wants to change a supervisor, let them change. In fact, the one that I was telling you, that's the only student that I have let go. I actually helped her identify a supervisor. Because obviously, okay, I initiated it in this particular case. But still, if the student wants to change, don't get upset. You know, sit with them and say, why do you want to change? Okay, so maybe let's find somebody who can assist you. I know such and such a colleague, maybe you could approach them. Take it in a very collegial manner. Please don't take it as an attack on your abilities. Sometimes relationships just don't work. Okay. Okay, we've talked about, okay, the only one we haven't done is publishing with your student. Shall I give you first refusal? Publishing with your student?
Yeah, I think it's fine for me as long as it's becomes complex when the students are also starting. I think if the student is full-time student, as long as it's related to the project, maybe in terms of literature review, systematic literature review paper, and publish, is also a different experience. I find it difficult when the student is a staff member and goes and publishes on econometric model, and then we are doing something on dynamic capabilities in organizations. And so you're actually finding that you're cooking two pots. You can't then say, no, finish that pot. So I always think there's
a conflict, some sort of.
Publish in the area that you are obviously studying in, and you hope to be.
Okay. So from my side, I think one of the things I try to do is to publish with my students. And that's very important. One of the issues that I think somebody raised it, we're actually having a conversation about this in the morning, right, when we're coming. One of the issues that we have is in South Africa, we have a problem of supervisors who want their names on papers which students write, but they don't write any. If they say, because I supervised your work, my intellectual property is in whatever you're doing, so my name must be on the paper. That's actually unethical. You have not written the paper. Your name should not be on that paper. You must at least contribute something to that. In fact, at the moment, a number of journals now ask if it's a co-authored paper, they ask what percentage of the paper did you write. So that's very important. At least for me, all my students, if my name is going to be on that paper, I have to contribute. And to be honest with you, most of the students that we take, maybe it's a bit different here, most of the students that we take, even colleagues, When they write the paper and you look at it, you go, no way my name is going on that piece of paper. So you have to take that paper and then turn it. The ideas are there, right? So you turn it into something that is actually publishable. So you don't just put your name on something because it's been written. You must make sure that it's in a good state. So I try to publish with my students. What Prof is saying about supervising members of staff is very important. In fact, I have a colleague that I'm supervising. We've published 2 papers together so far, but she's also publishing with other colleagues in the department. And sometimes, unfortunately, I have found that she's taken the ideas that I've given her in the supervision process and published the paper with others. You know, it's part of it is what it is. And I think that fighting doesn't really help. And I think setting the expectations at the beginning is very important. You must tell them that what I'm putting in this process is my intellectual property. So when you write papers, we need to co-author. But co-authoring means you must write. Authoring doesn't mean put my name on it. So it's very important. Yes, please. Yeah. Yeah. It's really important. Dr. Marongo. Okay, Marongo and then. Okay. For the people online, I hope they can hear Prof. Okay, all right.
And note that we should make sure that when a paper is being out there, and it's reputable. But I wanted to say, once you have decided you agree to co-author with your students, the concept of conflict are coming. Therefore, the supervisor should be, his name or her name should appear as students, whatever, because the concept is originated from the student. So the students should come first, because there are some supervisors who say, no, because I'm the supervisor, I need to come.
That's a very interesting point before I come to you, because there actually is a student where I have come first. I wrote the paper, the whole paper, but because it was, the ideas were based on the student's PhD, I had to put the student's name. So if you're going to use a student's work, firstly, get permission. I had to ask this lady. I've been trying to get you to write on this for 3 years now. And now other people are publishing in this area. We were first movers. We are no longer first movers. We need to get this done. Can you please draft a paper? Nothing coming. Okay, Prof, do you want to write the paper? I said, if I write the paper, then I'm coming as the first author because I've written the paper. She said, oh, all I want is the paper. I said, okay, all you wanted is a paper. I'm going to write the paper. My name goes first. So what Dr. Marongo has said is really important. But I just wanted to highlight that there are cases where you have to be practical. There's no way I'm going to write 100% of the paper and put the student as the first author. Not going to happen. Okay, we'll have that hand and then this one. Yes. Some institutions require publication, some don't. We used to require publication in ours, but actually it wasn't a publication, it was a submission of the publication. It was a submission of a publication. But what we discovered was that students would write rubbish papers and then send them to journals, and then journals started hating receiving papers from our institution. So it was really ruining the university's reputation. So we've now changed that rule. Students have to submit a draft paper alongside their thesis. So they write the paper and it's submitted and it's reviewed to make sure that it's actually a good paper, but it's not sent to a journal until the supervisor works through it and they know that it is ready. But there are still institutions that require publication. So it varies from institution to institution. It's a very dangerous thing to do though, because it can really ruin the reputation, and good papers also end up not being accepted. But at the same time, we've also introduced some, actually I'd say a lot of institutions now allow a PhD by publication. So instead of writing a monograph, you do a series of related papers and then you write a chapter that connects them. That's how I did my PhD. So we've now introduced that rule in our university. So now I know, for example, my students, the ones that started this year, that's the model that we've decided to take. We publish the papers. When we have the 3 papers that are required, then we write the connecting chapter, and then the student graduates. Yes. Sorry, do you just mind raising your voice a little? Mm.
At what point does the supervisor come in
to the paper? To the paper.
Yes.
Okay.
Sometimes you find that, for instance, the supervisor, okay, starting from the beginning of the end, to appear as if it's no particular paper was given. So now, at what point or what criteria should be so that this is them for from the paper? Because sometimes you find that the paper becomes so good. Then sometimes again the paper will be questioned. But the student produce this paper?
Okay, firstly, I'm very suspicious of people who question the quality of a good paper. It's a good paper. Why are you worried about it? It's a good paper and it's got the student's name, it's got the supervisor's name. Why is that a problem? So that part I'm a bit, but in terms of where do you get involved, I think it really depends on the student and you. Firstly, the ability of the student. You know, sometimes like someone said yesterday, you gotta do what you've gotta do, right? Some students really just can't write. So what I do with my student mostly is we start together and say, okay, what is this paper going to be on? The idea is ours, the 2 of us. This paper is going to be on this section of the PhD, okay? And then I ask the student, go and write a framework. Just a 1 page of what's going to go in the introduction and the main body, and do me a framework. They do that framework, then they send it back to me and make comments on the framework. Things that I think is wrong, is right. I think this will not take us in the right direction. This will be, I do that. And then once we're happy with the framework, I then let the student proceed and write the whole paper, right? Normally, I would do that. There have been 2 cases where the students have been so weak in their analysis, I've said, okay, I'll do the analysis. Normally, I'll let the student write the whole paper, then they bring it to me. And then I start to rewrite. That's normally what, because normally at that stage, we are in the training stage. Normally the student has not published, or if they have, they've not published in a good journal. So my role is to now look at the journal we are targeting, restructure the thoughts, because normally students would just summarize their thesis, right? They're not really, so I will do the whole thing again, and then I send it back to the student. The reason I do that is that it now gives the student a perspective of what a paper should look like. So they read that, and then if they have any addition, so it keeps going forth and back between the 2 of us. And then once we are happy with the content, I then say to the students, these are the author guidelines from the journal. Now structure the paper according to the journal. Then I take the paper back and make sure that it meets the author guidelines from the journal. Then we submit. And 99.9% of the time, the student becomes the submitting author, because they need to learn. It's a mentoring process, right? They need to learn how to submit. So that's how I approach it. I don't know if that helps. I don't know, colleagues, if you want to add anything. Okay, so, Okay, I think there was a hand. Yeah. Okay. Is there any other hand? I think I have already exceeded my time. We've already done questions and comments. I think that is covered, so we can move on. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Prof. Very insightful. And before we move on to how to publish, or how to publish, but nevertheless, who are kind of a working break, really break. So just we'll have about 5 minutes of stretch before we move on. So you can be stretching, even as I'm talking, you can already start stretching, but the drinks will come to you so that you don't waste so much time with that. Just for those that may be inconvenienced in any way, our convenience will suggest just when you go out here, just to your left, you will find a convenience room somewhere there, ladies and gentlemen. And for those that did not manage to register yesterday, who were not around yesterday, you can still register your names. Mr. James Mugenga there. So just in case you didn't register, you show you where the register is. Okay, so we can just, it's circulating. It's somewhere here. If you don't see it, you can still see him.